Hi, everybody, and welcome to Pixel Politics, the podcast that links politics and video games in a unique, new, and positive way. This is the podcast that seeks to educate us about politics and history using the power of video games. And today we've got an awesome guest on. She's a professor at a university in New York. She's called Vanessa Haddad, and her specialism is in looking at how video games can educate us. Thank you, Vanessa, for joining me.
Thank you, Jack, for having me.
So, Vanessa, can you just explain a bit about your work and what you do?
Sure. So, what I do on a day-to-day basis is I teach at Suny, Erie, and I am a chair of liberal arts general studies. And so I run the department, I teach there, and then I also do some research on video games. And so my dissertation concerned how video games impact college students on a day-to-day level, specifically male college students. And I do other projects specifically in theoretical issues around gaming and how they can be used for bettering our day-to-day lives, as well as looking at some newer kinds of things with Twitch. So how gender and masculinity are performed through streaming as like its own curriculum, basically. So a little bit all over the place, and I'm also interested in issues about how technology can be used in education and popular culture in education. And also some issues around media literacy, which is very much an American issue. So,
So I'm particularly interested in you just said about how video games impact, say, male students at college. Are you seeing when your research gets published or when you gather your results that male students just tend to just play video games and not focus on college, or does it actually have a positive impact?
So it's kind of it's a tricky question to answer, but what I found in the students that I worked with was that actually it had a very positive impact overall, because it's not so much that the students that I worked with were using gaming as a distraction per se. I mean, they certainly do, but it didn't detract from the academic experience at all. And in fact, it enhanced it. So some of the students that I worked with, they went on to be very successful, medical school, law school. And so what gaming really did for them was it helped them to create strong relationships and bonds with other students. It helped them to have some sort of actually academic momentum. So there's transferable skills depending on the type of game that are or that is being played that can apply to other areas of life. So it's essentially like having a hobby, just like anything else. And except that it does provide additional benefits through narrative exploration and skill building that other forms of media just don't offer.
Yes, I remember I kind of am still a college student. I'm doing my master's at the moment, but obviously it's very different because of COVID. I'm at home, I'm 100 miles plus away from university. But I remember in my first and second year, it was a great, bonding exercise to get to know fellow flatmates and dorm mates and trying to, make new connections. Countless nights I'd play video games with some of my pals, and some of the best nights of university, right? And so like that's that connection that you can draw from the power of play it's I don't think people recognize that much, and especially during university when you're very isolated and you're away from home. Video games really allow you to connect with people. You just talked about certain maybe genres of games that are particularly great at maybe educating people or teaching them new things. What are those? Is there any genres or particular learning-based games? Obviously, you've got games such as, I don't know, brain training, which is at its core, its main function is to train your brain and to learn new, to develop your skills. But is that sort of what you're saying, or are there ever other sorts of genres?
So yeah, that's definitely there's certainly positive cognitive benefits to games like that. Certainly that they're designed explicitly for that purpose. There's there's so many avenues to kind of take that conversation. Some people use games as a therapy, as a way to unwind and relax, and so anxiety management can be a big part of that. So that would be kind of like one skill, is like a coping mechanism or sort of fleshing out emotional management issues, which can be accomplished through narrative types of games or kind of like casual
Yeah.
sort of relaxing styles of game. Then there's games that teach a lot about things like history. So I've had students who've told me in various conversations that they've learned more about history playing games like Assassin's Creed
Yeah.
than they ever did from a particular course, which I don't know if that's just a reflection on, the game itself being particularly well designed and immersive, which I suspect is a big part of it, because it engages you in a narrative that's a lot of fun while also exploring really interesting places. But so that's another thing. So there's that historical piece, that immersion piece that can teach a lot about events that we wouldn't be able to experience otherwise. Games provide a simulation for things that we just don't have access to. So there's that piece to it. And then, of course, there is a physicality aspect. I am not necessarily a big fan of first-person shooters, but they do actually improve reaction time.
Yeah. Well, for some of
To
us, I'm terrible at them. Like mine doesn't get any better, but
Yeah, I never got to the point where I could develop much with them. Like, this is
no,
too
I think
frustrating, and
mine
I'm
are
like
getting
off.
worse, to be honest. Yeah.
What did you play?
I play a lot of Warzone at the moment,
Mm,
but I used to get quite a lot of wins before the new season took off in
mm.
Warzone. And now this season, there's just tons of new kids on the block, and they can just shoot fast, and they're much quicker than me. And like now, I feel like I said to my friend last night, I was like, I feel like I'm just getting worse at this. Like just every day I play, I'm just getting like worse. My reaction times are getting slower and slower and slower and slower. But like you said, it can improve reaction times definitely.
I find I play a lot of chess too. I'm
Hmm?
slightly a mix of old and new school in some things, and
Oh, I love
I
that.
love playing chess. Like, I play it almost obsessively, and I find that if I play when I'm tired or not feeling well, or if it's late at night or something, my rating just plummets. Um, there's something about. I mean, it's really interesting to see in real time the direct relationship between where you are in your physicality and mental state in comparison to performance on cognitive tasks like that. So I don't know if
Yeah.
there's any sort of thought you might have with that, but I don't know. Maybe you're getting worse because it's, something else impacting that. I have no idea. I'm just theorizing out loud.
Work
But
levels, work
yeah.
levels. What's that combination of stress, right? Like I'm trying to play the game to relieve my stress.
Hmm.
And so at the back of my head, the back of my thoughts, I've got all of this. I need to do this. I need to do that sort of thing. I need to do this next assignment. I need to do this next feature piece, whatever. And I'm
Hmm.
thinking about that while I'm playing the game, so I'm not fully immersed. So I'm guessing that's why the reaction times are slightly off. Like it's probably
Mm,
something to do with that, I guess. But
yeah.
you're saying about chess, like yeah, chess is great and it's a classic. Right? Are you great? Are you really good at chess? Are you like pro level?
No, I'm not pro level
No.
by any stretch. I would say I'm kind of like low level intermediate. It's
Okay.
something I've done like throughout my life or on and off, where I come back in and out of it. And the more time you spend away, the more time you have to spend kind of getting back into it and
Yeah.
remembering certain things and patterns. And so I try to make an effort now to play on a daily basis at this point, just so I don't have to go through that again.
It's that constant grind. And you were saying about Assassin's Creed. Um, hopefully, in the next couple of podcasts, we're looking to get an Egyptologist on the podcast. And he actually has created a video game series where he plays Assassin's Creed Origins, which is based on ancient Egypt. And so he's going through the game and explaining all these little features of how it links back to the past. So you can see that clear sort of comparison there, and that's super interesting. And I think that I think as the games have got more complex, they've got these more immersive worlds. They're starting to become more educational, I guess, because they become more realistic.
Mm.
What do you think about that?
Oh, that's absolutely true. Certainly, there's the aspect of them being more realistic combined with fantasy that provides an experience that nothing else has ever been able to provide before. It's a new level of storytelling that gives us access to experiences that are really exciting and interesting, and then that that happens along the way is almost like incidental.
Mm.
So yeah, that I would love to hear more about Assassin's Creed and
Yeah,
Egyptology and all of that. And I know that's a fascination that comes and goes in popular culture on and off,
yeah,
especially in the past 100 years or so. So that's kind of cool too to think about, like situating a game like that with the historical aspect of explorers and archaeologists, especially in from the UK running to Egypt on and off and bringing mummies back and all that kind of stuff. Like that's kind of cool to
yeah.
think about.
Exactly, and like usually, video games are associated with that kind of like it's that hobby or something you just play with your pals. But it is like it's becoming more kind of you can learn stuff from this and you can learn stuff from that, and like we're saying with Assassin's Creed, it's not just Assassin's Creed Origins, it's Odyssey as well with the Greek mythology they've got going on there. Like, I mean, a lot of it is purely purely fiction, uh, but there are there are elements that are non-fiction as well, obviously. So there's like getting
Hmm.
that fine balance between it, and even games such as The Last of Us, it's obviously not teaching us anything historical, but in terms of tackling social issues, it's very influential in that aspect as well. So it's educational in that way. What do you think about? Because there's some people on Twitter who always say politics shouldn't be associated with games at all, and that they should be
Hmm.
separate. What do you think about that? Do you think you can learn
Yeah.
something from games in terms of like political, some political natures and say social diversity?
Yes, and see what here's what makes that question complicated.
Yeah,
Of course, certainly on the surface, definitely learning would occur. You know, you experience a situation where you can put yourself in the shoes of someone else, and I know that was a big thing with The Last of Us, especially the second
hmm.
iteration of it, right?
Did you play it?
And I haven't played it. No,
Okay.
I'm familiar with the narrative, but I haven't gotten into it. I don't have a PlayStation anymore. It's been many years since I've had one. I'm more of a PC person,
Yeah,
and Switch when I feel,
Switch is
kind
great.
of laid back.
Switch is great.
It is. So with the political piece of it, though, it depends. Okay, I think there's in the gaming community in general, there's a bit of a mistrust. And this isn't certainly true of everybody. It's just a broad stroke generalization. I think that there can be a bit of a mistrust amongst uh, gamers and game players around the intention of narrative.
Yeah,
And so I don't think that necessarily you couldn't learn well from saying, oh, this character is transgendered and maybe this is what they're dealing with, or this person unfortunately went through an experience where the decision they made was to murder somebody that, maybe people agreed with that, maybe they didn't, right?
yeah,
Uh, so I think when there becomes an issue of mistrust between player and developer and corporation,
yeah,
that's where the experience can get kind of lost,
yeah,
or the learning opportunity can be lost, because I think what happens is the consumer, the game player or gamer, might say, this narrative is being pushed at me because somebody else decided that I need to consume this narrative because they're assuming I'm X, Y, or Z,
hmm,
right? And with if once that level of mistrust is established, it's not going to be necessarily a positive learning experience for the player, right? So and where that mistrust comes from is another question entirely. But there seems to be this idea, because people have been much more openly critical of design and narrative and tropes and all this other stuff, that the average or regular, I shouldn't say average or regular, but the more maybe serious game players, which are predominantly in general white male, but the vast majority of people of all backgrounds play video games. But the type of game that's consumed is it changes depending on the demographic. This idea that, well, these people think I need this narrative. They're driving this narrative. They're either trying to make sales or have notoriety or whatever. And so then that mistrust creates, just a lack of understanding or willingness to consume, an experience in a way that maybe it was intended or not intended to be taken.
Yeah, I completely agree. It's kind of you see these enterprises and businesses, or I'm not saying Naughty Dog have done this, but you try and like force, maybe not force, but you put these try and tackle these social issues in the games themselves, and like you were saying, people that aren't necessarily, but they are prepared for it, but they don't want it to kind of be pushed at them, especially if it's like it's kind of like woven into like the story in sort of like its main narrative. Yeah, but then at the same time, I don't know what's better. Is it best to tackle, say, social issues or other issues more discreetly, like, or is it good to kind of like push them in, put them in the main story? It's an interesting, it's a dilemma, right? Because you can be seen as too pushy or not pushy enough, and
Yeah, it's not a position I'm envious of for developers and writers, because these are big decisions. It's when you're creating media that is impactful and powerful. Do you create ephemera, or do you create something, with more teeth or meaning, or something that gets people to pause and think? It's I think that's something that stage theater has battled with for as long as it's been popular, right? Like, what story is being told, and why is it being told in a particular way? And when you are creating a story, do you decide to push, something that you want people to feel and understand, or do you just go, I'm going to Michael Bay this and make it really entertaining, just for its own sake, right? And there's no right or wrong answer to that. But I don't, we're in an environment now where very few people can really do much of anything without receiving intensive criticism. So I think, it's probably easiest to just say, I'm going to make what I want to. And some people will like it, some people won't. And that's that, because you just can't please everybody.
I love that technical term, Michael Bay. Michael Bay, is that a proper technical term? Like, just put loads of money into it.
It probably
Wait, just a spectacle that just doesn't have any kind of narrative at all. Like, I don't want to go off on a whole rant about Transformers, but like, yeah, you could just see he just put tons of money into production of Transformers, nothing really coming out of it in terms of narrative-based story. It's basically just robots battling each other.
Exactly. And that's like, it's interesting to see like this push right now for the new, I don't know what, Godzilla versus King Kong movie, and I'm like, no one's really interested in that, right? I don't know. I can't tell if the interest is genuine or not, but I'm just like, why? Why?
I don't think it is. Honestly, I'm not particularly interested in that. Like, after the first King Kong, not the first King Kong, but the most recent Kong movie, I was like, that's enough of that. It's just monsters. It's just monsters fighting at the end of the day. But that's why, like, I do think games are one of the best mediums for telling stories, because they're so complex and they've got so much depth. And obviously, in movies spread across maybe maximum 2.5 hours or longer if you're Lord of the Rings, which is a great thing. It's not a bad thing. But with a game, like it's over like 30 hours or 60 hours, you could really like explain this story, which I love so much. It's like, as a narrative medium, it's one of the best, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have like a favorite game that you like to play, or like has a really good narrative, or teaches people something?
Oh, there's so many. It's hard to pick just one, but if we're talking narrative, I guess I'll backtrack for a split second and say that I am a very dedicated Civilization player. So
Ooh,
that was like my historical sort of
that's,
interaction with gaming. That's a lot of fun. Have you played?
I love it, but I'm not very good at it. That's the thing.
Wait, which version have you played?
I played, I think it's the PS4 version. That's like, is there 8 of them out? 7?
Six.
6.
And but
Oh.
then there's like some in between versions. Like there was a space one. I forget the exact title of it. That was just kind
Ah.
of not all that great. But, I mean, it wasn't. I shouldn't say that. It wasn't for me. I didn't enjoy it too much. But there's actually one of the most memorable gaming experiences that I've had with narrative is this
Mhm.
game called To the Moon. It's
Okay.
this indie game. I want to say it came out in 2011 or maybe a little bit
Mhm.
later. That is it's kind of a debatable whether it's really a game or not because it's much more of an interactive narrative.
Yeah.
But it's really neat because the premise of it is you play this character, John, who is dying, and then
Mm.
these doctors show up. It's kind of like this interesting mix of kind of like sci-fi sorts of stories. But as John, you've contracted these scientists to show up so you can pass away with a really fantastical experience that you pre-chose.
Yeah.
But the issue for John, unfortunately, is that parts of his memory are missing. So he has to go backwards in his memory and in his life to piece things
Mm.
together. And actually, it parallels like trauma therapy in a way because you learn more about his life in retrospect and I hope it's okay if I give spoilers. I mean, it's an
Of
older
course,
game at
yeah.
this point,
Yeah.
but you find
Spoiler
that
warning.
John. What's that?
I was like, spoiler warning.
Yeah.
I'll put up one of those like spoiler warning tabs on the YouTube video, just like.
So you find that, as you go backwards, John actually had dedicated a lot of his adult life to his wife, who he had met young, who she had Asperger's syndrome or
Yeah.
autism spectrum disorder. And so you learn about the nuances of that through their interactions. And as you float back through John's life, you get to a point where you see that one of the things that really messed him up and was a key piece in his upbringing in life was he witnessed a very traumatic car accident um, that really, and if I
Yeah.
remember correctly, it was his younger brother who passed
Yeah.
away from that. So once the doctors are able to help him kind of piece all of this together, he's able to, have the experience that he wanted to have. And that was like it's just so mind blowing. It touches on so many things, trauma, float back with therapy and those kinds of experiences, autism.
Yeah.
It's just like, it made me an existential disaster. Yeah.
Emotionally, right? Yeah.
Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had a few games like that as well. Um, I kind of get touched a bit through some historical games. One game is Valiant Hearts. I don't know if you.
Mm.
Yeah, I love that game, and you know, becoming that soldier and working your way through the events of World War One with your dog, your war dog. It was very touching, and Ubisoft done a great job there. And I think with these indie titles as well, there's a lot of opportunity to create sort of more personal story-driven games. And there's instead of these big AAA titles, they're not as they can not as touching. Well, they can be, but the smaller ones are really uh, where some of the best narratives come out of as well. Would you say it's like you agree with that? Like,
in general, absolutely. What I find that's really great about indie creators is they're willing to go outside of a box that I think you don't necessarily see in the same way in commercial titles, in terms of how a story is told. And a game like Gone Home or Dear
yeah,
Esther, those types of things, there's a magic to them that you don't really find all that easily in other like big scale commercial titles. And that's really kind of a disappointment that I have with the industry in the last probably 10 years or so, is that narrative quality in commercial games has just really tanked. In general, I think. I'm not saying that there aren't, uh, great things
yeah,
out there, but I just, I just find that like very few things are released totally finished,
yeah,
or thought is put into them in the same way that it would have been. Like if you think about Final Fantasy VII, what made Final 7 so great wasn't the graphics, right? It's the story.
yeah,
And I was so disappointed coming across the re-release of it. There's so much emphasis was put on the flash of it, visually, and
yeah.
like the voice acting was written so unnaturally, and the storytelling was just like, is this the same game? Is this the same? Or like, what happened,
Yeah.
15, 20 years later that completely changed the dynamics of one of my favorite games of all time? I didn't know what to do with that. So
Yeah.
it's just like,
Oh
what
no.
happened?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I think PlayStation with their first party properties, they are pushing towards this sort of high quality narrative based experience, and like separating themselves from Xbox, who aren't really. They kind of got all of the games on there, but PlayStation are kind of like focusing, say for example, God of War or The Last of Us, like we mentioned, or even Days Gone, which wasn't a great game. And even zombie games are heavily saturated in video games, and I'm not a big fan of zombie games either because they scare me. Zombies scare me. Uh, they scare
agreed.
you too. Yeah, exactly.
Oh
It's like,
yeah. Oh yeah.
but yeah, no, I think like you're saying, like the indie games really kind of they're focused on that narrative based story, and I think the AAA games are losing it slightly, and they're pushing towards just trying to beef up their profits, and like we mentioned on the podcast before, at the expense of workers and their livelihoods. For example, we say it all the time, but it's Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk came out and it was half baked, it was half finished, and it was supposed to have this great narrative story and this future reality, but it just didn't live up to the hype. And unfortunately, I think half of it is down to it's nothing's living up to the hype anymore because we expect too much. But it's also down to like, where's the quality narrative experience? Like, you focus on the graphics for these next generation consoles or whatever they are, and I have the PS5 here, and it's like, well, like it does go great graphics, but where are the games? you know.
That's the most shocking thing to me about the PS5 is like what I guess like once I kind of realized that a lot of stuff that is on the PS5 is also available on the PS4,
Yeah.
and you can still play with people like regardless of which version you have. I'm just like, why is this such a I mean, now granted, I'm not a specs person. I'm not a hardware person per se. I mean, I just buy like a preloaded gaming laptop and then I just move on with
Yeah.
my day. I'm like, does it have enough RAM? Good. Okay, great. So, it's so I guess I wouldn't really notice like the
Sure.
finer details to a point where it's going to change my experience so much. So I guess that's something I just kind of fundamentally don't quite understand. But
Yeah, me neither. Like, I could barely set up the podcast.
mm.
So like that's as far as my tech knowledge goes.
Yeah, Yeah,
Um,
I know what you mean.
so like I think also another subsection of gaming is VR and virtual reality. Are you seeing this as is like in terms of your research? Are you seeing VR becoming this new opportunity for educating people through games? Or was it sort of
Yes,
overhyped?
it is and it isn't. Where it's really great and where VR really excels is in simulation for training purposes. So in terms of like real life simulation. So um, things like nursing school or games
Yeah,
for training for nursing school or medical training, military training, that kind of stuff. Like that is 100% where it excels. It's not the biggest market though, so I don't see or foresee a whole lot of development commercially moving more in that direction. But in terms of enterprise for training and education in that sense, it is growing in that capacity. So, I mean, just the idea that you can practice surgery in real time without
yeah,
actually harming anybody is pretty great. You know, which is good, or like practicing innovation or those types of things before you actually practice them is fantastic.
yeah, exactly. And I think VR games such as Beat Saber is well, yeah,
Hmm.
I'm not going to train to be a Jedi, am I? Like, not going to happen. And but I think there is sort of untapped potential there to kind of expand it further and make it more immersive. Because I don't know about you, and I'm not sure how much experience you've had with VR itself, but I wasn't that impressed when I actually used some of the headsets. I think it's not that immersive at the moment. Something always happens, like I trip over a lead, or something else happens, like I don't know, it falls off my face, or I like hit a banister or something, which did happen once when I was in a VR booth. Like I like turned around doing Beat Saber and I like slammed into a banister, which was quite
Oh
funny.
my
It was
God.
actually quite funny, so you can laugh.
No, it's not that. I'm just thinking like you know, like if that were me, I would be like seriously injured. Just, like I would probably have like this big bruise and oh my gosh.
Well, the funny thing is that like I think it was using like a PlayStation Move controller, and so the controller took most of the brunt of the damage. Like it didn't really hit me that much, and so like I took off the headset, and like everyone looked at me like, "What? Like, are you okay?" I'm like, "Yeah." I'm like, "Is your equipment okay? Because I don't have insurance here, and I can't pay for it."
Oh my gosh.
But it was good.
Was it?
Yeah, it was good. It was fine. It's fine.
Oh
As
my
I
gosh.
think loads of people go into these booths and like end up kind of like tripping over themselves or whatever. So not
Mhm.
to don't have too much experience with it. But yeah, I wasn't that impressed with the immersive nature of the headsets.
Mhm.
Um, I just don't think they've reached their potential yet. I really don't. It hasn't got to that like Ready Player One scenario, obviously. Um, if you watch Ready Player One, and is that as like a
Mhm.
scary reality for you? Scary for me.
No, you know, it just it didn't really scare me at all. I just thought it was I don't know how to explain it exactly. It was matrixy, it was
Mm.
somewhat realistic in a way, and also a little too cartoonish to take seriously. I don't know. That's like I just said like the three most contradicting things possible. Um, I mean, there were some really great things about it, but the idea of, especially in that opening where you see how people are living and they just kind of plug into
Mm.
this other reality, in some ways, you know, isn't necessarily so far off from a lot of people's reality anyway to begin with. I mean, it's much more exaggerated um, in that film and in that story, but it's you know, it's probably more relatable for people than not relatable, actually, I would guess.
Yeah, I think so. Um, I think it'll get there eventually. Next so many years, hopefully.
Mm-hmm.
So I wanted to ask you. So when you're teaching, so what do you teach about as such? Like, do you like how do you explain certain issues using games, and what examples can you give?
Yeah, so I teach a lot of different stuff. I'm a little all over the place. In my main position, I teach basically, to put it simply, how to college, how to life, to a degree. I teach a first year immersion course, and then I also teach a course about professional portfolio building and presentation and resumes and that kind of stuff. So,
Can I book a session?
What's that?
Can I book a session?
So those are kind of like I do very pragmatic stuff in my main position, and then
Yeah.
the reason that I maintain positions elsewhere is so that I can do more of the stuff that's field specific to me. So at Niagara University, I've taught sociology, intro, research methods, popular culture, and then right now I do a course called video games and culture. So I do that there, and then at the University at Buffalo, I mainly do technology for social studies educators, pre-service teachers. So it depends on the context, but I've used lots of different games for lots of different purposes. But maybe one I can highlight that I've used across platforms, or not platforms, courses rather, is called Two Interviewees. It's a really interesting indie game where it highlights a lot of the social issues that are kind of difficult to talk about when it comes to job searching and life. Are you familiar with this game?
No, but I'm super interested.
So it's really cool. I mean, graphically, it's very pixelated, I guess you could say. And it's created by an Italian designer. So I have to kind of explain certain things to my students because they'll see things written in other currencies, and sometimes there's some slang that is probably more British than American. But in terms of the translation and all of that, so it's a really interesting game because it takes a male and a female job seeker and puts them side by side, and the questions and appearance of the characters influence the way that the interviewer responds to them.
Right.
And the kinds of questions that are asked change. So, for example, if the male character, if you decide to place an earring on him, then the interviewer makes assumptions about the character that are not necessarily positive. For the female interviewee, if she doesn't wear jewelry, then the interviewer assumes that she is dour and kind of just like something's not right if she's not wearing makeup and this kind of stuff. And so then the boundaries get pushed in terms of the questions that are asked. So you're asked a question, you get response A, B, C, D that you can answer with, and that changes the outcome of whether you get the job or not. Questions about salary, do you plan to have kids? Are you married? That kind of stuff. That's not necessarily legal, whether it's in the EU or in the US. So I've talked. So I brought that game up in my first year seminar course. I've brought it up in my sociology course. I've also brought it up in my social studies education and tech course. So it's a platform or a game that actually allows to dissect a pretty serious topic in a way that people don't really expect.
Wow, that sounds like incredible. Like for a smaller title that can kind of have that kind of impact and look into these issues in terms of getting work. I'm going to check that out. What's it called? Sorry, what's it called?
Two Interviewees.
Two Interviewees. Was that available? Is that PC and?
It is a PC title. It's available off of the creator's website, just as like a direct download, which is also really fantastic because when I go into a classroom and I've used it, that's one of the most important things with educational games or using games in an educational setting is licensing and costs and all of
Yes.
that. Oh my goodness. And also too, just like a learning curve. If it's got to be easy to play, it's got to be accessible.
Yeah,
You know,
exactly.
otherwise it's just it's too much
Well,
to
this is
deal
why
with.
I always kind of take my hat off to some streamers who play with friends or people guests they invite on, because the games always have to be sort of easy to play, and it's the same as these games as well, right? And
Oh, completely.
do you see your students are more engaged when you talk about games?
Oh,
Yeah,
completely. Yeah, it changes the tone of the room so much. Like usually, in an in-person environment, pre-COVID times, I don't really get into it a whole lot until there's something relevant
yeah,
to, you know, um, discuss that's game related. So one of the cool things that I started to do before COVID was I created a project for my first year experience students to design a game where they can uh, teach others about the important things that they've learned about navigating higher education and how would you make that fun and interesting.
yeah,
So I like the idea of using design thinking as a way to encourage people to think about how they would do something or create something that could be beneficial to others. So I try to think about those kinds of things in a classroom setting.
yeah. I think there's something about a game that when you mention gaming or when you say, "Oh, we're going to play," even as like when I was back at school, um, when my teacher used to say, "Oh, we're going to play this game," or "We're going to, I don't know, use this piece of software to do this," all of us used to get excited, and you know, we used to love playing the games. And so I think it's just like saying cognitively that in the back of our heads is like we just like challenging ourselves and competing with our friends, or kind of like learning new things through like technology that kind of like engages us even more. I
Hmm.
think definitely.
Yeah, whenever there's an interactive gaming experience in any of my classes, like the tone of the room immediately changes.
It's
They're
like
like,
Kahoot
oh,
or something.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. And so I love doing that where I can accomplish that. It's fun to surprise them and because they don't necessarily see it coming, and then they're like, oh, we're gonna have a discussion. Here's a lecture, maybe a video, and then I'm like, we're gonna play video games today. What?
yeah, I exactly. They all just pop up like meerkats. Like what, where, when? It's like I wish my lecturers allowed me to play video games. Oh, one
Yeah,
day,
it's
one day.
it's fun. So you've played have you played any games in your courses?
Uh, none,
Ah,
zero.
bummer.
So I do. Yeah, I know. So I done an undergrad in international relations, Essex University, and I'm doing a political masters at the moment. Yeah, for none of that, it's like the closest I've got to is say politics on the internet. That's it. There's like no game, like because there is opportunity and there's potential to actually kind of introduce games into that syllabus, because you've got games like the Political Machine. Have you heard of the Political Machine?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, it's a great PC game where you're basically a political candidate and you're going to try and make your way up to become president, and you've got to start campaigning and everything. And it's a great way of teaching you how to campaign and how to kind of make your way through that political process. But unfortunately, I haven't had the opportunity to be able to play any kinds of video games in my course. I'd love to. I think I'd have to take up a whole new computer science degree in order to do that. Hopefully, it changes. Like I say, VR, it opens up that kind of door. You can be immersed in these new realities, and technically, that kind of does become a game because it's kind of separated from your reality as such. Um,
Hmm.
how did you get interested in this whole field of work? Was there any particular like turning point?
Yeah, it's kind of accidental. Um, More so than anything. I mean, I grew up playing video games. They've always been a part of my life. I'm, part of that. I would consider myself, I'm not even sure what the divide is exactly, but like an older millennial, I guess you could say, sort of in that tail end of that group. But my brother who I played a lot of video games with growing up, was much more Gen X, and so
Right.
I played a lot of 8-bit Nintendo games, or really, frankly, watched him play a lot. Sharing is, always a
Caring. Yeah.
question mark. So, so I watched him play a lot, and we
Yeah.
played a lot of games together. And as a family, we played a lot of Nintendo games together, Dr. Mario and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so it's just always, and even before that, actually, I sometimes I forget about this, but I had my dad's old Commodore 64 from his college life with the big floppy disks and like lots of weird games on it. And
Uh,
like some, I don't know, like cartridge system you could plug into the thing. And I had yeah, I'm really dating myself here. But
no,
point
no.
being that like it's always just been a part of my life. And as I got older, it just like it's not something I ever like stopped doing completely. It got a lot more into things like Tomb Raider and The
Yeah.
Sims, City, and stuff like that. So by the time I got to my graduate studies, and I started my doctorate in 2010,
Yeah.
and it was like, was it 2009, somewhere around there. And I first went into it interested in looking at comparative and international education, specifically higher education, and
Mhm.
thinking about creative and innovative ways that equity can be, or and inequity be addressed. Because certainly, human capital is such a roll of the dice in terms of who has what talents and all of that kind of stuff, and where you're going to find um, people who have missed opportunity to develop into their best selves is really anywhere and everywhere, frankly,
Yeah.
because you have stratification in all societies, and then you have this dimension of developed versus developing countries.
Mhm.
So I was really interested in those types of topics, and I still am to a degree, but it's not what I focus on. But actually, there was a bit of a turning point where, in my studies, my university had a conference where we had some guest speakers talking about video games and education, and just showing like these really weird, well, what I consider weird. They're not weird games, but games that I just thought were kind of silly and
Yeah.
like a little too on the nose in terms of being educational. Like, or I'm just like, it's like you're hitting me in the head with a hammer about
Sure.
navigating something. And I'm like, this is just ridiculous. Like I had a very negative reaction to it initially.
Yeah.
Um, is I just thought like people were inventing something that was just gimmicky. And that
Yeah.
was how I took it at first. I'm like, games are a part of my life. What on earth is going on? What are these people talking about? Especially, I think one of the biggest things that irritates me with researchers are the ones that don't actually engage in games, and it's
Yeah.
almost always super obvious. Um, I guess one other point I'll bring up about that briefly. There was a book that I read for a course I took in popular culture as part of my doctorate. And this is where I started to think about it a lot more, were these
Mm.
issues, and that's how I got kind of turned on to this. Um, where the author of the book kept talking about how games are so good for you and all of this kind of stuff, but he kept making like tiny errors in how he was talking about games, like the Zelda game, Wind Waker,
Yeah.
kept referring to as Wind Walker. Um, and I just was sitting here like,
Yeah.
how many millions of copies has this book sold? And clearly, this person is not engaged. And like, you don't have to be engaged
Yeah.
with things to talk about them necessarily. But like, come on, do better.
Yeah. Yeah. Although, like, yeah, exactly, do better. But although with video games, because it's such a rich medium, you kind of, if you're talking about a game specifically, you kind of, I guess, you do have to kind of be engaged with that. At least get the name right, you know.
So stuff like that, it really just started to rub me the wrong way. And I'm
Yeah.
like, okay, it there's a level of authenticity I think that needs to go along with that kind of work for it to be high quality. And the more that I thought about it, I'm like, I want to I have a lot to say about this, and so I switched my focus at that point. So
That's super interesting. I love that because, like part of this, the podcast and what I'm trying to do with the whole platform is to it's kind of along the same line of thoughts as you. And there's like a through line there. It's trying to educate tiny bit just through games and how, and how that's possible. And, one of the ways that I was thinking about doing it was possibly jumping on like maybe Twitch or like a streaming platform and like inviting guests, because I don't have any kind of knowledge on Egypt. I don't have, I'm not a historian, but like inviting someone on to kind of, talk through a certain game. And I do think there's a degree of untapped potential in gaming at the moment. Like you said, you're talking about maybe certain academics that don't fully grasp some games or what they're trying to say. And, the classic argument that video games cause violence it's something that is not actually proven, and it's just been people saying it. For example, Donald Trump has said it, and obviously he's not an academic, far from it. But but still, like, but there have been people who have been saying, "Oh, it causes violence," and there needs to be facts on the table, like you're saying.
yeah, that's a really tricky thing because there's this tendency in culture for people to be afraid of mediums, right? Like long before video games are bad, we had, you know, I think it was in the 80s in the US where there was a group that Tipper Gore headed up where songs were blacklisted and that they caused all sorts of bad behaviors.
Yeah.
Like Prince songs, Madonna, Twisted Sister, all this stuff. And that is how we got the birth of the parental advisory sticker. So there's this group, of people that in the media literacy world that would be considered protectionist, and meaning that we need to keep things from harming others. And there is some legitimacy to that if you consider that there is a monkey see, monkey do element to people, right? But that's a very childlike state. That's something that I think that's like Bandura with the punching the Bobo doll, right? So yeah, we can monkey see, monkey do, but the vast majority of us outgrow that, right?
Exactly.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
So it's a scapegoat where the human development is sort of taken out of the conversation as something that happens away from this childlike way of thinking. Well, I see this thing, therefore I do this thing.
Yeah.
And certainly, it's an unfortunate thing in the US where, I mean, we do have a lot of issues with gun violence and shootings. And just last night, again, that happened. And it's, and I'm sure video games will come up in that conversation. Oh, well, the shooter played Call of Duty, so we need to re-examine this. And even though Trump fell into that camp, Obama fell into that camp too, and he diverted millions of dollars into research on video games and violence, and it's nothing. It's definitely nothing new. So the one thing that they do is certainly raise our aggression level if we play a violent video game. Like they do raise our aggressive response, actually. So that is something to be conscientious of in terms of being like shorter tempered or having more adrenaline and this kind of thing. But that's not enough to, be a sole cause of a lot of the horrible social issues that we face.
Exactly. And, I think there's still research needs to be done on it. I don't think it's not, one side hasn't claimed victory on that, on that hill, but still, like, it's interesting. And, I think, gaming is more of a positive thing than a negative thing at the end of the day, and it can do more good than bad, in my personal opinion.
I definitely agree with that. And although certainly, just like anything else, it is a neutral tool that, in the hands of the right people, can be very powerful. So,
Exactly. Well, Vanessa, thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure to have you on. Uh, where can people find you? Have you got Twitter? You got other social media platforms and channels?
yeah, so I'm mainly on Twitter.
Okay.
You can find me at Vanessa L. Haddad
Mhm.
on Twitter, and then LinkedIn as well. So just my name. So.
Okay, perfect. Well, thank you. And that's been Pixel Politics, the podcast, episode 8. Thank you for joining us.